Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at the History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and the History Guy himself at locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with the History Guy, books behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at thehistoryguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. On today's episode, the History Guy tells the history of two kinds of animals and their use in warfare, especially their use in World War I. First, he tells the story of pigeons, from their domestication to their use as messengers on European battlefields in World War I. Then he tells the story of mercy dogs, also called hospital dogs, who searched the barren no-man's land for injured soldiers throughout the Great War. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
If I were to ask you what is the smallest soldier to have been awarded a medal in the Second World War, your guess might not go as low as 9 ounces. Homing pigeons have been used in war since antiquity, but their role continued surprisingly well into the era of mighty machines. And the wartime contributions of homing pigeons is history that deserves to be remembered. Fossil evidence suggests that the rock dove, Columba livia, the wild bird that is most commonly called simply a pigeon, originated in Southeast Asia, but the species has had such a long association with humans that it is today impossible to determine its original range. In fact, most experts assume that the pigeon is the world's oldest domesticated bird, with its domestication mentioned in both Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets and Egyptian hieroglyphs more than 5,000 years ago. Domesticated as both food and as pets, humans have spread the species far and wide, and millions of the domesticated pigeons have become feral, interbreeding with their wild counterparts, to the point where the bird's range covers nearly 5 million square miles, and the European population alone is estimated to be as high as 28 million. 5,000 years of breeding have resulted in many fancy breeds. The ability to breed for traits fascinated, among many others, Charles Darwin, who owned a flock and was a member of pigeon clubs. Pigeons impacted his work, and he used them as examples of variation of animals under domestication. While many were bred for decoration and some for food, others were bred to select for the species' extraordinary capacity for homing. Homing is an inherent ability of an animal species to navigate towards an original location through unfamiliar areas. Homing can be used in migration, a way to return home, common in birds, but also salmon and loggerhead sea turtles, and the tiny red-bellied gnu, which at just 3.5 inches long, will travel sometimes miles over rugged terrain to return to the same spot in a stream. Homing in pigeons is a bit of a mystery, as the rock dove is not migratory, but the pigeons do have an ability to return home to their mate and nest. The most popular theory is that homing pigeons use magnetoreception, navigation by using the Earth's magnetic field, although the exact mechanism for how they detect the field is still a matter of debate, and some studies have found pigeons are able to return home even if the magnetic field is disrupted. Other cues, from olfactory navigation to navigating by visual landmarks, has also been suggested. In fact, it is possible that different types of homing pigeons use different types of navigation. But whatever the mechanism, homing is an exceptionally easy characteristic to breed for. You simply let the birds out and only breed the ones that make it back. The incentive to breed for the homing skill came from the sport of pigeon racing, releasing pigeons to see which returns to its nest the fastest. While it isn't clear exactly when the sport was developed, it was at least well established in the time of King Solomon, some 3,000 years ago. The homing skill could be effective over enormous distances, with some races occurring over distances in excess of 1,000 miles, and with sustained speeds in excess of 50 miles per hour. The corollary to pigeon racing is the Pigeon Post, the use of pigeons to send messages, where their speed and homing ability made them superior to almost all means of communication before the electronic era. There is record of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, using homing pigeons to communicate across the vast Persian Empire some 2,500 years ago, and pigeons were used in ancient Olympic games to alert a winner's hometown of their victory. The use of a pigeon for post has a limit in that, in general, the pigeon only homes one direction, has to be physically moved to the second location, and their size limits the size of the message they may carry. However, by placing their food in one location and their nest in another, pigeons have been able to be trained to fly back and forth between two locations over distances as much of about 100 miles. A version of a pigeon post was active in Baghdad at least as early as the 12th century, and a pigeon post was used by Genghis Khan to keep track of his empire in the 13th century. Pigeon posts were used as late as the 19th century between the California mainland and the town of Avalon on Catalina Island. A homing pigeon service in the 1890s between Great Barrier Island and Auckland, New Zealand, called a pigeongram, issued stamps, making it, some argue, the first real airmail service. The rare stamps are highly prized today by philatelists. Less successful was a late 19th century pigeon post used for marine search and rescue in Nova Scotia, where pigeons were flown from lighthouses on islands to the mainland. Because of the harsh conditions, the pigeons suffered a high mortality rate. When Paris was besieged by the Prussian army during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71, Parisians communicated with the outside world using pigeons, and the Prussians employed trained hawks to disrupt the service. As microphotographs had been developed in the 1850s, pigeons could carry hundreds of messages on a small roll, and more than 1 million messages were sent via pigeon during the 4-month siege. Given their reliability and speed, it's not surprising that homing pigeons have been used in time of war. In the 10th century, Olga of Kiev, the regent of Kievan Rus, demanded a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house, from the besieged residents of the Drevlian city of Iskorosten, in exchange for ending the siege. Instead of ending the siege and bringing peace as promised, she had a small cloth of sulfur and pitch bound to each bird, and when they returned to their homes, they set the city ablaze, burning it to ashes. During the Second World War, behaviorist B.F. Skinner theorized that a pigeon could be conditioned to recognize a target and drive a glider laden with explosives, essentially pecking on a control when the glider moved off target. While this early attempt at a guided missile attracted some military interest, the so-called Project Pigeon was eventually abandoned as being impractical when compared to competing projects. In 1908, a German apothecary named Julius Neubauer developed a small camera that could be set with a timer and attached to a pigeon for the purpose of aerial photography. The German army investigated the military potential, but by the Great War, aerial technology had developed to the point that airplanes were a better platform. Still, the idea persisted into the Second World War, when the German army apparently trained dogs to carry a pigeon in a basket behind enemy lines. The pigeons then flew back to the German lines with cameras that took photos at 5-minute intervals. While the Soviet army reported capturing a German truck that included cameras and equipment for pigeon photography in 1942, it's unclear how much they were actually used. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency developed a pigeon camera during the 1970s for use during the Cold War. Reports are that the pigeons would be dropped from airplanes. The details of the camera and the results of the program are still classified. But the most successful use of war pigeons was as a messenger. The use of messenger pigeons in war is ancient, and there are several references in Roman texts of pigeons being used by Julius Caesar to communicate with his armies during the Gallic Wars. Hannibal took pigeons with him to keep Carthage appraised of his progress as he crossed the Alps. When the British defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a pigeon was the first to carry the news of the victory to London. By the 1800s, pigeons were an established part of every major European army. The greatest use of pigeons in war was during the Great War. On the cusp of the electronic age, the war featured old and new technology. Where conditions made it impossible to string wires and radio technology was undependable, pigeons were a relatively reliable form of communication, with some claiming that they achieved a success rate more than 95%. Estimates are that as many as 500,000 pigeons were utilized during the war. Pigeons were an important part of the new technologies of the war. Aircraft and tanks were fast-moving and often discovered urgent information to carry back to headquarters. Radios of the day were too large and unreliable to be carried, and pigeons were carried by both, as well as by warships. When the U.S. first deployed tanks under Major George Patton at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, the lead company sent a pigeon named President Wilson back to headquarters with a map of the location of German machine gun nests. Pilots found that they could throw pigeons out at any altitude and they would successfully fly home, although you had to throw them carefully to keep them from hitting parts of the aircraft. Pigeons were such an important means of communication on both sides that troops would shoot at them, knowing that they were carrying messages. Some troops were issued shotguns for exactly that purpose. In at least one case, an American spy camouflaged a white pigeon named Babette with soot, so it would appear to be a crow, making it less likely that the Germans would target it. The pigeon made it back to headquarters with information about a German attack, allowing the Allies to thwart the attack with artillery. A pigeon named Le Cirque was credited with capturing a German submarine. When a French beach watcher sighted a German periscope off the coast, Le Cirque got a message back to Naval Command so quickly that British and American destroyers were able to trap the submarine and force it to surrender. When the famous Lost Battalion of the U.S. 77th Infantry was trapped behind enemy lines during the Battle of the Meuse in 1918 and cut off from other means of communication, a pigeon named Cher Ami, or Best Friend, flew through enemy fire to alert command as to the battalion's location. The timely message saved the battalion from a misplaced Allied artillery barrage that was dropping on the lost battalion and allowed the Allies to advance enough to withdraw the battalion. Cher Ami carried the message 25 miles in 25 minutes, despite having been wounded by German fire, having lost a leg with a hole through her breast. For her courage, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French. Surgeons saved Cher Ami, including providing her with a wooden leg. She returned to be part of the Army breeding program, and after her death in 1919, was taxidermied and is on display at the Smithsonian Institution. Despite the advance of radio communication, homing pigeons still played a vital role in the Second World War. The Royal Air Force carried pigeons with bomber crews, where they were reliable means of informing headquarters when a plane had crashed. The RAF estimated that 1 in every 7 of its bomber crewmen who were rescued after being shot down over the ocean were rescued as a result of a message sent by a pigeon. In one case, the crew of a Beaufort bomber shot down over the North Sea in 1942 was rescued because their pigeon, a bird named Winky, managed to make it home despite being covered in oil. Winky didn't have a message attached, but the RAF were able to calculate the position of the downed aircraft using the time difference between the plane's ditching and the arrival of the bird. Pigeons were so valuable in airborne operations, where communication could be notoriously spotty, that the U.S. engaged a brassiere manufacturer to create a special sling so that a pigeon could be carried by a paratrooper. A cage with a parachute was also developed to allow planes to drop pigeons to isolated troops, and prior to the D-Day invasion in 1944, thousands of such pigeons were dropped throughout the countryside, asking French citizens to reply with information about the location of German forces. Pigeons played a vital, if almost unknown, role at D-Day, as there was a concern that radio communications were being monitored by the Germans. An Irish pigeon named Paddy was the fastest pigeon to return to England with news of the success of the D-Day landing, traveling 230 miles across the English Channel in less than 5 hours. For his speed in the delivery, Paddy was awarded the Dickin Medal, called the Victoria Cross for Animals, one of 32 pigeons to be so honored during the Second World War. Another pigeon to receive the award was G.I. Joe, who in November 1943 was able to successfully carry a message when all other means had failed. The Allies had called in an air bombardment on German troops in the Italian village of Colvivecchia, but the Germans had withdrawn at the last minute and the village had been occupied by British forces. The Americans realized their bombers were about to bomb Allied troops, but were unable to successfully raise command by radio. G.I. Joe made the trip successfully in 20 minutes, arriving just in time to call off the bombers. Pigeons dropped behind the lines with paratroopers were commonly used to communicate with resistance units. One such pigeon, named Commando, successfully completed more than 90 missions. The pigeons, carried in mobile dovecotes, were used on all fronts. A pigeon named Blackie Harrington successfully carried a message during the Battle of Guadalcanal regarding the location of Japanese troops, despite being hit with shrapnel that tore off part of his neck and chest. Surgeons were able to save Blackie, who spent the rest of his days in the breeding program. The underappreciated war pigeon is no longer used by most armies. The U.S. Army Signal Corps shut down their pigeon service in 1947, and the British Air Ministry Pigeon Section was shut down in 1948. But the Swiss Army maintained a pigeon section clear until 1996. There's been some indication that homing pigeons might have been used as part of asymmetric warfare in recent years, and pigeons have been caught being used to smuggle things into prisons. And there is a current concern that homing pigeons might be used as a method to deliver bioweapons. White doves, which are sometimes traditionally released as a celebration of weddings and at the opening ceremonies of Olympic Games, are actually homing pigeons that have been bred for their size and their color. And they're supposed to be able to return home, although because they haven't been bred for their homing ability, a distressing number of them don't make it. Still, it is an interesting irony that a technology developed for war has become an international symbol of peace and love.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind the scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. So, something I learned, which is only kind of tangential to this episode actually, is that apparently doves and pigeons, and when you look at their taxonomy, they're the same thing. They're they're not actually different animals. In most languages, they don't differentiate between doves and pigeons. It's always interesting to me how many things that I think I thought I knew, and then I look into it and it turns out that doves and pigeons are really why we consider them separate. That's just 'cause.
Yeah, just because.
Another thing that I really found, surprising in this episode was how early doves were domesticated. Pigeons were domesticated. Because I don't think if you had asked me before, if you had been like, oh, what's one of the first 5 animals domesticated? I don't think the pigeon would have been in my mind.
Yeah, but I mean, they're relatively easy to domesticate to catch, and they're good food. I mean, if you're quick, you could probably live on pigeon if you live in a city, right? You'd probably
even
die
today.
because they eat all sorts of toxic stuff, and they're, you don't want to eat city pigeons. But they probably as a food supply they were initially, and earlier than you thought. Yeah.
And you did an episode on the passenger pigeon. There was a time when a pigeon was, these days I think if you were like, oh, I'm going to feed someone pigeon, you're like, oh, that's gross. Because
you think of a city you can
pigeon.
find squab in nicer restaurants.
Sure.
But you wouldn't eat pigeons from, you eat squabs that are raised for food. But there was a time when it was a primary protein in the United States, certainly it was pigeon, yeah.
Yeah, well, there were lots of them.
Commonly would eat pigeons, yeah.
Yeah, we don't seem to do well. I mean, we must do to some extent if we're serving them at a fancy restaurant, but there doesn't seem to be real.
They are. But I think in the passenger pigeon, when we mentioned that the squab, it's much more expensive than chicken, but there are places that raise squab, commercially, but that there's just not that many of them. Yeah. But yeah, you wouldn't. I mean, they're saying pigeons, like city pigeons. I mean, they call them rats with wings or whatever. That's probably not fair to them, but. They eat a lot of trash, and they end up you'd likely be getting battery acid and all sorts of stuff. It would be eating like a city rat. It wouldn't be healthy meat,
Yeah, whatever they're eating.
I think they
you're gonna
suggest
get some
that you put the rat in a cage and feed it corn for a while until it's gotten a poison out of its system before you eat a rat. So I mean, it's kind of the same thing about pigeons, city birds, yeah.
They're scavengers. They're just eating whatever garbage, and it turns out we throw away.
I don't know how we got there, but if you see like rock pigeons and the numbers that they're in, and how easy it is to spook them into a net or a cage, and raise them as food, then you can see why they were a relatively quickly domesticated animal, and that they traveled with us all over the place. And the homing ability probably came later. Recognizing the homing ability came later. You're right. I don't think now like city pigeons have interbred with wild populations and stuff like that, so they're essentially all the same critter.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and 100% because of humans. we moved them around with us, and now we moved them with us.
We took them with us. They interbred with us, and well, I mean, just like dandelions, right? They followed people, and now they're all over the world.
It's an interesting way, and it was not something we brought them with us deliberately, but we didn't realize that we were going to essentially just make all one pigeon species.
I don't think anybody thought, someday you can walk around New York and there'll be a million pigeons.
Be the same pigeon you'll see in that does remind me. In high school, I got to travel to Europe, and we went to Venice, and in St. Mark's Square, I think is the main square there. There's a lot of pigeons, and there are several. I'm not necessarily proud of this. There are several pictures of me because I laid down in the square and put food on me so that the pigeons would climb on me. So there are.
That's kind of creepy.
There are numerous people.
When you were very small, everybody can remember this now. This is my son. Yeah, when you were very small, we were feeding seagulls, and you darn near got carried away. I mean, there's no other way. But you had a bag of chips. And those seagulls wanted that bag of chips, and you were just a little toddler, and so it was a little hairy there for a moment. I think they were capable.
Those seagulls were almost as large as a toddler.
Yeah, I think there were enough of them that they could have made off with you, and I don't know. We could have caught you, but we got there in time.
So apparently I have a history with feeding random...
You do, apparently. Well, I'm glad the pigeons didn't get you.
There were several other people, tourists, who took some pictures of that. So there are people in this world somewhere who have images of me as a 15-year-old in St. Mark's Square covered in pigeons. I wouldn't recommend it. Pigeons are kind of gross, but there were a lot of pigeons in St. Mark's Square. That's what I recall, and they would be the exact same pigeons that I saw
if you're
in the
going to
US.
travel, especially like the age that you were, what was it? That was high school. Then you might as well get a spectacular picture. It's better than hanging off the edge of the Matterhorn, or
that's true.
Others that are more.
I'm glad I didn't catch something from a pigeon. I don't know. I'll know what I could have caught.
Who knows? Yeah, who knows what you could get from a pigeon? Who knows? Yeah, bird flu, presumably, right? So.
Yeah, something. Probably not good to. You wouldn't go. Touch a bunch of city rats. You probably shouldn't go touch a bunch of city pigeons. But I did, and I lived to tell the tale.
I don't know anybody's been killed by a pigeon. I really don't. But...
Sure, although someone might be able to point that out. Someone on the internet can find an instance.
Oh yes, so someone might. Oh yeah, this guy was killed by a pigeon. I don't think it's very common.
No,
I don't even think Sully's plane was brought down by pigeons, right? I mean, I think that was
something bigger than
seabirds
that,
of some sort, right?
I think so. Gosh, I can't remember. I'd have to look it up.
How dangerous are pigeons really? That's where this has gone.
How dangerous are pigeons? Watch out for the pigeons is our main message of today's episode.
Yes, don't trust a pigeon. Yeah. Now people who raise dovecots are going to be mad at us because we vilified pigeons.
Well, and I think if you're keeping it relatively, feeding it, grains and stuff like that. But as we said, I don't actually think pigeons are very dangerous.
I hope for most people raising it aren't eating them, but I don't know.
I have no idea. I don't know who's. Well, it seems like these days you'd be a lot better off just in terms of like meat per pound raising a chicken, which you can do in a lot of places.
Well, apparently, squab, has its market.
Yeah.
There's squab. There's people who raise squab, so that's it's out there.
I think a while after we did this episode, I wrote an episode on microfilm, which was curious because it has a much more ancient history than I thought, which actually not that ancient, but it was older than I thought because it seems like something we would need modern technology to do, and it turns out we figured out.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't think of microfilm in the Franco-Prussian War, and it was important in the Franco-Prussian War. Yeah,
specifically, and so you mentioned that here, and so I kind of was like, how important were pigeons in military communication before reliable electronics and radio?
I mean, they were used, back into antiquity. And, how much did pigeons change the war? Did pigeons change the world? Communication has always been important. I didn't find any story that said that, Caesar got this message from the pigeon just in time to do this or that. But I mean, I'm sure that they were an important part of military infrastructure. Certainly during the siege of Paris, that was like the famous use of the pigeons. And it was at least an important way for people of Paris to not feel like they were cut off.
It was the only way they were getting in news.
Yeah, there's even an interesting story there where one of them covered the pigeon in coal dust so they wouldn't shoot it, thinking it was a crow. And So I mean, how much that was exactly doing, because the Paris surrendered they lost the fight. So obviously it didn't necessarily change the outcome, but I mean, clearly it was at least at that point very important as a way for you to be able to communicate outside of that. So I think certainly pigeons were. I don't think they played the role that, say, electronic communication does today, because I don't think they were quite as reliable as electronic communication today. But they played an important role in military infrastructure, really from ancient times, and all of that is important to keeping your empire together. I mean, how do you keep an empire the size of the Roman Empire together? How do you keep an empire the size of the Persian Empire together? There's a reason that they saw pigeons as a way to help do that.
Yeah, you had to have a way to communicate somehow, and you can run, which they did. I mean, that was half the reason why Persia had those great roads. But the pigeons they've got a remarkable thing that humans don't, and that's the ability to go find where they're supposed to.
And much faster, homing. So I mean, it is interesting to try to figure out the logistics on using that, because essentially it's a one-way process, and then you usually have to transport the bird. But I mean, they played an important role, and that role continued on. I mean, that's one of the things that's kind of surprising about it, is how late militaries were still using pigeons, because even today there's ways that electronic communication can be intercepted that makes them, makes you wonder, why aren't we still using pigeons sometimes? So I mean, it's who really knew that we were using pigeons in the Second World War? I mean, that was kind of a surprise doing that research too, at least the extent that they were using the Second World War.
I had no idea.
Of these paratroopers jumping out, they've got a pigeon cage attached to their equipment. because that's wherever you are. You know, you don't. You know, your radio might not work well, but I mean, the pigeon's going to find its way back to England, and that's interesting.
Or at least it has a pretty decent chance to.
So I mean, they carry pigeons on military, these huge military aircraft of the Second World War. You got a pigeon, so if your plane goes down, the pigeon sends the message, saying where you are. That's incredible.
Yeah, that was incredible. I was totally surprised by that. I didn't realize you don't hear about pigeons in World War II. World War I mean, that's kind of the famous time when you use pigeons.
Yeah, when they were using pigeons. Yeah, and I mean, we had radio in World War I too, but it was a lot harder to use in a lot of different ways. So you can see why pigeons were maybe a more important part of it. But it's hard to imagine, and it's literally a fact that these people were going. They were going to war with these huge wagons full of pigeons, and that was certainly a part of the military infrastructure. So certainly in the Great War, there's a lot with the pigeons. But I mean, before and after, I mean, they've always been this part of an infrastructure that makes you almost surprised that they're not being used today. Because you could still see where their utility might be working today.
As a redundant source of communication, you really can. And they probably don't, they're small, they probably don't eat that much. They seem to be, I mean, based on that image of them being carried by the paratroopers, they seem to be relatively easy to carry around.
They're only so reliable. I mean, you don't know when you send a pigeon that the pigeon's going to make it. But... And
they were frequently targets, and I think that's why you would end up sending, more than one pigeon. And in World War I, you can see where, I mean, gosh, that was kind of one of the first wars where, our artillery started getting us to a place where you weren't just shooting at what you were looking at. Indirect fire was a big deal. And so you had places where you literally were firing weapons and you didn't know where you couldn't see physically where those were landing. And it's an interesting story that, that these, pigeons were sometimes their best means of communication.
Yeah. Well, they would not have found the lost battalion if it weren't for the pigeons.
No, the pigeons.
So, but it's also interesting that there was still in the Second World War attempting things like strapping cameras to them and seeing if they fly over the Russian lines and get back in time.
Yeah. See, that was an interesting, and of course, by World War II, we also started to have just more reliable methods of that. But using them for aerial photography is an interesting. Of course, you can't control the pigeon.
You'd love to see what those pictures are.
Yeah, I wonder how.
And then all the way then in the Cold War, we're strapping it to the CIA strapping them to pigeons. Yeah.
Yeah, there's that story. The CIA tried to. Use a cat to do something like that they
got hit by a car
immediately after. It turns. I mean, that's the problem with the animals is that they're only so. You can release a pigeon and maybe it's going to get eaten by a cat in the 3 minutes.
That's true. I mean, there's different things that can happen to pigeons, but there's in your all sorts of radio communications to be intercepted and stuff too. But the homing ability of pigeons made them particularly useful for and not just war. I mean, that's a cool thing about the episodes that talks about a lot. I mean, there's a while where there was an island in New Zealand that was the only way that they had mail. Was to send pigeons. It's just a fascinating history for something that now, I mean, I think very few, except for there's still a hobby of pigeons, of using homing pigeons. But I mean, now they're essentially just a hobby, and I guess occasionally in a nice restaurant you can get a squab, and it's interesting because pigeons are important to history. I mean, they were. If you look at this and also the passenger pigeon episode, I mean, they were important in war. They were important as a food supply. There was a while where, really you would have thought when you thought about animals that were important to the human race, pigeons would have been well up the list, with farm animals. And now, they're mostly pests in a city. I'm sure there's a lot of people still enjoy feeding pigeons, but I mean, I think most people see those, masses of city pigeons as being almost pested, and a very rare, item in food. And it's interesting that it's made that change because there was a point where we were literally giving medals of heroism to pigeons.
And
that juxtaposition where you got a military airplane or a tank, and there's a hand coming out with a pigeon.
And coming out with a pigeon.
Shows how, I mean, that overlap is just fascinating.
Between these technological marvels, honestly, for their time, and the fact that we were communicating with these pigeons,
Caesar used.
It struck me several times during the episode. You talk about these pigeons, such as Cherami, who was important in saving the Lost Battalion. One of the things that I think is really interesting about that is that we did award them, but we didn't just give them medals. I mean, surgeons saved that bird, and it's amazing.
Jeremy had a leg blown off and shot through the breast and made it there, and the surgeon saved the bird. Yeah, they didn't have it for dinner. Yeah,
they were not just these something that was a dispensable item that it's done now. It's
yeah. I mean, that was true. I mean, we'll talk about that with the dogs too, but I mean the horses too. I mean, I think there were quite a number of soldiers, even in the trenches and stuff, who understood the sacrifice these animals were making. And I mean, there was exceptional effort in bringing Cherami home because Cherami had done something very, very brave, and that is extraordinary. To think about it, I mean, that I think that episode starts talking about what's the smallest soldier to have received a medal in the First World War. That 9-ounce soldier was important enough that they the surgeons. I mean, well, who would think a pigeon would survive a gunshot wound?
I know, right?
Any effort to do that,
yeah, and to keep it alive, because that's something that
gave it a prosthetic leg. Well, Theodore Roosevelt had a one-legged chicken too, so I mean, you never know. But I mean, and it's probably not a bad life to go back into the breeding program. That pigeon was probably, I'd done my time. I got the 1,000-yard stare, and now I get to go home and make more pigeons.
Yeah, I wonder. People clearly cared about these animals. They knew
Absolutely,
what they were doing, and it's special. I think it says something about humans that we have that compassion. Even as we're putting pigeons in a situation that.
Well, even as you're sending pigeons up when they're getting shot, but also in the horrors of war that they have compassion for a pigeon. That says something about how humans work. Yeah.
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
Yeah, I watch a lot on Magellan TV. Today I was watching one called Tales of Irish Castles, and I love going to Europe and seeing the castles. And I know a lot of people don't know this. There's a castle 50 miles from my home here in the United States, but there's such history in them, and it's so. I mean, sometimes you're crossing a bridge they hadn't discovered the New World when they built that bridge, and you're still walking across it. So, Tales of Irish Castles is a series, and it really is a history of Ireland told through its castles. And the castles really have a lot to do with the English history in Ireland. That is that prior to the English and Strongbow and that the Irish weren't really castle builders. The English came in and built castles. And compared to England, a lot of the castles in Ireland are in better shape. They weren't destroyed during the Civil War and stuff like that. The English Civil War destroyed a lot of castles. So some of them are just beautifully preserved. And so it's called Tales of Irish Castles. You get a really good feel for the history of Ireland, and you also get to see these lovely, spectacular castles in great detail. And I really enjoy visiting castles. It makes me want to go to Ireland and visit some of these castles. Absolutely worth your time. I love Magellan TV. They're so much fun to watch. But I mean, it's as someone who just kind of enjoys. I mean, you just feel like you're somewhere when you're in a castle, right? There's a reason that someone built this. It is just an absolutely delightful series because the people that are telling the story clearly have a passion for the history of Ireland. One of the main announcers, I was a bit amused because he was clearly still mad that the English had come in the 12th century to Ireland, so that you get this the same passion for history that I think is one of the reasons that people love the History Guy, and it's one of the reasons I love Magellan TV is that there's things like this. I mean, this is a series, 6 different episodes, so I mean, if you're going to binge watch, why binge watch an old sitcom when you can binge watch the history of Ireland through its castles, which is just fun and fascinating. What have you been watching on Magellan TV?
It's a little bit of an older documentary, but it's called Wildest Places, Australia. And so it's very much a classic kind of, when I was a kid, I used to watch so much on Animal Planet and learn all kinds of stuff. And I learned a lot it's got 4 episodes, but even in just the first episode that I watched today, I was like, wow, I'm learning a lot about really weird things that live in Australia. And they talk about the famous ones you're going to hear about, kangaroos and koalas, but they talk about like these ants that go store sap from a tree. They just go hang off the ceiling inside the little ant holes, and they're literally just storage for when there's not water for the ants. And I'm like, that's incredible. They're just all hanging there like water cisterns.
Like they're a canteen for a water system. That's interesting.
Canteens, and then the other ants come up to them. It's so and that it was a lot about that kind of stuff. And then it talks about, I mean, it talks about everything you want to hear about in Australia. They've got crazy animals.
They do. Very, very different than North America. And
Yeah.
Natural history, one of the cool things about Magellan TV is that you don't just go there for history, which you do, but they've got a lot of great nature videos, space, true crime. They've got some fiction on there that's actually pretty good too, some historical fiction and stuff like that. So that's, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I've not been to Australia. I'd like to go to Australia. And my mom's been there several times. She's been on the podcast a couple of times.
Yeah.
And they're just different animals than we're used to.
Yeah, it's a really unique ecosystem, and it's something that was a ton of fun to learn about. Yeah, so that's called Wildest Places Australia.
I watched a lot of animal documentaries too. I mean, I watched Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and it's been a whole different generation than you do. But it really does bring you back sometimes. And there's nature is fascinating, and there's a lot of great nature stuff on Magellan TV. Thank you, Magellan TV, for sponsoring the History Guy. You guys always are great to us, and we do really love Magellan TV.
And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you. Sometimes a free month, or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, The History Guy talks about mercy dogs and the life-saving work they did during World War I. And stay tuned after the episode to hear us chat a little more with the History Guy.
If you were a soldier wounded in the Great War, lying in the cratered and muddied morass of no man's land, it might have been easy to lose hope. Many of those wounded would crawl as best they could, trying to find some cover from the enemy snipers and the weather, only hoping that they could be found by a friendly medic. But medics in that war had a unique way to find those lost and injured men. One that came on 4 legs, carrying a pack with medical supplies and maybe a drink. And if that soldier was unable to return on their own, the 4-legged friend might leave and return with a doctor in tow, all without uttering a single bark. Dogs have accompanied men into war for probably most of human history, but the Great War was the first war where they were used in an official and broad capacity to find wounded men. Mercy dogs, which were also known as casualty dogs or ambulance dogs, were used on all sides in the First World War, and they saved thousands of lives. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Dogs, of course, have been widely used by armies throughout history. There are depictions of dogs straining on their leashes as far back as the ancient Assyrians, although it isn't clear whether they were used in combat. Certainly dogs, especially mastiffs and other large breeds like the Molossian hound, have been used in combat since antiquity. Alexander the Great took dogs with him across Asia, and the Celts and Romans both seem to have used dogs widely in combat. Of course, dogs were used for much more than actual combat. They could be used to protect an army's supply of livestock, as well as warn the camp of spies or an ambush. They were especially useful for sentry duty, as they can sense threats and disturbances in the dark that others simply miss. They have been and continue to be used in special support roles, sniffing out bombs, foes, and the wounded. At the outset of the First World War, it was the latter that became their most important job. With the exception of England, all the European belligerents had military dog programs active at the outset of the war. Industrialization made even the largest dog less useful as a combatant, as no amount of specialty designed armor was going to protect a dog from a bomb or a bullet. In the 1800s, Germany began training what they called Sanitätshunde, or sanitary dogs, whose job was to find the wounded and the dying among the dead after a battle. Among the earliest was a program put together by animal painter Jean Bungartz in 1895, which was described as a novel experiment. By 1908, Italy, Austria, and France had created their own programs to train mercy dogs. Germany had around 6,000 trained mercy dogs by the outbreak of the war, and may have used as many as 30,000 dogs in various roles throughout the war. Mercy dogs were given the unenviable job of locating the wounded in the chaos after a battle. They could distinguish between the dead and the dying, and proved to be incredibly capable of triaging the men they found. One military surgeon praised the dogs, saying, "They sometimes lead us to the bodies we think have no life in them, but when we bring them back to the doctors, they always find a spark. It is purely a matter of their instinct, which is far more effective than man's reasoning powers." These dogs would often be outfitted with saddlebags that carried some medical supplies like bandages and liquor so that an injured soldier could drink to numb the pain or apply medical aid. Primarily, the dog's job was to find the wounded where no one else could. Wounded soldiers often crawled away from combat to find some place to hide, where they would often be missed by soldiers combing the field after a battle. The dogs weren't fooled, and they easily found soldiers hidden in the mud and the carnage. They were often trained to carry something of the soldier back, like a piece of a uniform or a belt or even a helmet, to indicate that they'd found someone, although some were trained instead to return with an attached leash in their mouth instead, as some of the dogs would actually tear off bandages in their mission to help the wounded. It wasn't just the belligerent governments that used dogs for these purposes. Various National Red Cross groups trained dogs to help locate wounded soldiers as well. These dogs became known by a variety of names: medical dogs, ambulance dogs, casualty dogs, and of course, mercy dogs. Many breeds of dog were used, but some were more prominent than others. In the early days, the Germans preferred English breeds, especially collies and English shepherds of various kinds. One of the most popular were Airedale Terriers, also commonly used as police dogs before the German Shepherd became popular. German Shepherds and Doberman Pinschers were also common. Other than a general belief that the best dogs were purebreds, many breeds served. German trainers also tried poodles, which turned out to be unsuitable because they are short-sighted, as well as St. Bernards and pointers. Dogs saw service on all sides and all fronts of the war. On the Western Front, the Germans used as many as 30,000, and the Allied powers 20,000 in support roles. It took longer for the Allied powers to embrace their use. France developed ambulance dog training before the war, but the first English training center didn't open until 1917. The most important single man in the English war dog effort was Colonel Edwin Richardson, an early proponent who had been training dogs for war and ambulance work before anyone else in England, and who helped train and educate militaries around the world on their use. At least 2 dogs he trained, Carlo and Robbie, served as ambulance dogs in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. Richardson assisted the French, Belgian, and even consulted with Americans before the war on the use of dogs in war, but only won support after 2 of his Airedales, Wolf and Prince, served with distinction as messenger dogs at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The Americans never fully developed a war dog program, although an 1896 article in the U.S. Journal of the Military Service Institution reviewed Germany's success and admonished that we have the best dogs, the greatest number of dog shows and dog enthusiasts, but had failed to even try to match the German program. Though a program never appeared, thousands of American dogs were donated to the Red Cross for use as ambulance dogs. Colonel Richardson said that the dogs were best used when the army was moving and that they were nearly useless on the static Western Front, claiming that the only ambulance dogs that were used with any success were those with the German army when the Russians were retreating. Despite this claim, there are countless anecdotal stories of dogs on the Western Front performing as ambulance dogs. The French army found that the Red Cross symbol the dogs wore was often ignored. Soldiers on both sides freely shot at the dogs, doing humanitarian work. The dogs were kept behind friendly lines in large kennels, and handlers were sent to the front to assist Red Cross doctors and nurses in locating soldiers lost on the battlefield. Because they were often made targets, despite their kind mission, they were usually used at the end of large battles and at night, when soldiers could search for the wounded and using lights would only attract enemy fire. They were incredibly good at their jobs. The journal of one German Red Cross worker describes working with his dog less than 400 meters from French lines and finding in short order 5 wounded, 3 severely wounded, and 2 slightly wounded, which even with the sharpest eyesight you could not have found. French dogs were described as returning from the lines to their kennel, then to bark and turn back to indicate they had found a soldier. The soldiers could be found at the bottom of deep ravines and other sequestered places, so well hidden that it could take a whole day to get the soldier free. The dogs, unaware of the larger causes for the war and innocent of it, still served with an incredible bravery and commitment. One French dog called Frusco was credited with saving more than 100 men. In one battle he saved 3 badly wounded men by allowing them to grab onto his collar, one at a time, and physically drag them to safety. Another dog called Steiff was given the Iron Cross when he charged onto the field to rescue a German lieutenant shot in a failed attack. Steiff grasped the lieutenant's coat between his teeth and, foot by foot, dragged him to safety. Steiff was shot at least twice in the rescue attempt, but recovered with the soldier he had rescued. Perhaps the most famous dog who served with the Americans was Sergeant Stubby. Stubby was of uncertain breed. Contemporary news described him as a Boston Terrier or a kind of terrier mutt. He was found on the Yale University campus and adopted by the 102nd Infantry as a mascot after one soldier smuggled him onto the ship bound for France. But Stubby proved he was more than capable of doing his part. Though he was not trained as a mercy dog, he was said to have located and rescued numerous soldiers, as well as warned his unit of incoming artillery and gas attacks. He was wounded several times, given a specially made gas mask, and sewn a coat that held his various awards. His title of sergeant was not in jest, either. After attacking a German spy, he was put in for and given the rank of sergeant. Of course, there are many other anecdotes about the heroism of these dogs, with names like Rags. In addition to locating and rescuing soldiers, the mercy dogs were also known to find soldiers who were too wounded to be saved. Many of these dogs remained with the dying soldiers, providing them with some comfort in a situation bereft of it, and making sure that those wounded men did not die alone. Mercy dogs also became a symbol of patriotism. An American military recruitment poster with the image of a dog wearing a red cross says, "Even a dog enlists. Why not you?" A young girl who sent her dog to be trained by Colonel Richardson wrote that, "We have let Daddy go to fight the Kaiser, and now we are sending Jack to do his bit." A Frenchman wrote, "I already have 3 sons and a son-in-law with the colors. Now, I give up my dog, and vive la France." They were widely depicted in propaganda as steadfast heroes on the front and were included on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post and Red Cross magazine. They were elevated to heroic levels and attributed human emotions and characteristics. Of course, like the soldiers, they suffered for their service. Shell shock, now recognized as a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, was first recognized during the Great War, and certainly affected dogs as well as humans. It is estimated that 7,000 dogs were killed in the war. It's not known how many wounded soldiers' lives were saved by the mercy dogs of the Great War, but there is firm evidence that the number is at least in the thousands, including at least 4,000 Germans and 2,000 French troops. And in addition to mercy dogs, they also were used to deliver messages, which they could do faster than any human, as well as to serve as scouts and sentries. Mercy dogs continued to be used throughout the 20th century, in the Second World War and by the U.S. in the Korean War. Today, search and rescue dogs are used to find injured and trapped people after natural disasters. Despite the human tendency to anthropomorphize animals, of course, dogs know nothing of patriotism and politics. The war must have been as terrifying to them as it was to the wounded soldiers that they were sent out to find, at the risk of their own life. And yet they served in the Great War without question, saving lives and easing human suffering. It is important for us to recognize that service, to thank them. Truly, man's best friend.
So, of course, dogs are often called man's best friend. I've never seen that described more clearly and the reasons behind it shown more than in this episode. I honestly,
absolutely,
yeah. Rewatching this episode, this is I mean, I wrote this episode, and it's still an episode that brings tears to my eyes. It's a beautiful thing.
It's astounding the sacrifices that these animals made on behalf of people. And I think we see that today. I mean, there's police animals, there's rescue animals, there's all sorts of comfort animals and things like that. But I mean, if you think about the horror of war and that, men wouldn't, they called it no man's land for a reason, right? I mean, soldiers wouldn't go out there. And yet these dogs would, and at the risk of injury and at the risk of their lives. And I mean, it had to be absolutely terrifying for dogs, bombs and gas and everything. And yet they did it. At very least, they brought comfort to the dying, but they also saved lives. Yeah. It is an extraordinary story. I think the story's not well known. The dogs are being used in that way, and I think it surprises people still how many animals were being used in the First World War and even in the Second World War as well. But I mean, it's also just shows really that there's this ability of compassion that's in the dog that really is the reason they call it man's best friend.
Yeah, it sure seems like we train the animals and we get them to do these things that they don't necessarily want to do, but it sure seems like, I mean, there were multiple stories in here of dogs that were not trained as mercy dogs, and yet they still did those jobs. They found people, they brought people to them, they provided comfort for, I mean, in the face of terrifying, I mean, even just the sounds, dogs, most people's dogs these days, they've never had to face combat, thank goodness, but they're afraid of, fireworks, and now we're talking about dogs that we've trained essentially to run into explosions, and they were frequently injured. And again, like with the pigeons, I mean, these were animals that we cared enough about that despite their injuries that we were performing surgery on them.
Yeah, they had hospitals for the dogs,
Yeah.
I think they saw them as valuable military technology, but I mean, you have to think they had affinity for it, and that's true today too. I mean, the service dogs. I mean, there are real connections between the service members and the dogs, and then sometimes they're asking to leave the animals behind as like military equipment. I think that really shocks people because they see them as companions and see them as part of the part of the military.
Yeah, that they're not animals that should be.
They see that more as a compatriot, as a soldier, than as a truck.
It is, I think, one of the shocking pieces of this episode is that they do that soldiers on both sides shot at the dogs, and I kind of it seems really horribly cruel. But I mean, can you think of reasons why they might do that? I mean, why they're shooting at these?
Well, I mean, they are. I mean, again, they're military technology. They're out doing the service of the other side, and it's a cruel war. They also shot horses because they knew the horses could be used to move things and do things. And but I think part of that too was simply that the whole idea of no man's land is nothing's supposed to be moving out there, and if it is, it's a threat. Yeah. And so I think some of them, they were simply shooting at anything that moves. Yeah. And there's some dehumanization that comes in war. There might be some people simply shooting because it's something that they can shoot at, and I don't know. But I think there was some strategy with pigeons too. I think there was some strategy to say that these animals are serving the opponent's military, and we have to see them as part of the war.
Yeah. Well, and we focus on this in this episode that they were on mercy dogs, but they were used for a lot of different things.
They were, yeah. You see pictures in the First World War. They're hauling machine guns, and
I was just reading about the Belgians.
But you also see a lot of companion animals too. I mean, they're clearly not using those for a working animal. They just found a puppy, and it's the mascot, and it comforts people. And I mean, Sergeant Stubby wasn't necessarily a mercy dog. Sergeant Stubby did all sorts of stuff for the regiment. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of use of animals, and now of course in the Second World War we used them. The ranger groups used them as for hunting. I mean, for their scent capabilities and stuff. And so there's a lot of different breeds of dogs that have a lot of different skills, and they're used for a lot of different purposes. And they are still dogs that are of course still used commonly with the military. Very often you see military accompanied by dogs these days.
Yeah, and they do. It's changed. We're not using dogs for the most part the way that Alexander the Great was, where they were war dogs.
I don't think there's any war dogs out there anymore. Yeah, I don't think there's anybody using dogs to attack, per se. But I think they're mostly used for sniffing capability and stuff like that. But I mean, they can do some things that you cannot do. That no machine that we've invented can do as well as the dog can do. Yeah. And their dogs are guard dogs. They warn you that something's coming, which is important, in war.
One of the things I read that, and I guess one of the reasons why someone might have shot at a dog, the Germans trained some of the dogs to go out in front of infantry and find trenches, and they would bark if there were people in that trench. And so if you're the British or the French, you learn pretty quickly that a dog showing up and barking at your trench probably means the Germans are about to show up. And that's,
so you can see how that's dangerous. I mean, a German dog is still a German dog. I mean, the dog probably doesn't care about the politics, but he certainly is. They're using him for a reason, right?
Yeah, and they carried messages, and I mean, they're just like shooting at the pigeons. There's a reason you want to stop a message from getting someplace that could be a real significant part of a battle, and they're in combat. It's a sad thing that we're putting them there, and these dogs, don't care about the politics of it, but they're caught up in but it's just one of those, it's another one of those things that happens anyway. And I think that certainly we've talked numerous times about what it means to be heroes, and whether dogs are being heroic or not. But it sure seems like that they knew they were in danger. They knew they were in places that they didn't necessarily want to be, and they were still doing jobs anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it had to be absolutely terrifying. Yeah. And that they could train them to to not run away from shellfire. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, and that they would.
We talked about with like Sergeant Reckless too. That I mean, there were places where we used a lot of mules, and also and horses in the Second World War, and some of the animals just never could get used to shellfire, and some of them would be calm in shellfire. I can't imagine training a dog to do that. I can't imagine training a dog that's going to go out, and I mean, dogs know they're being shot at. They know that they're in danger. And still doing their job. I mean, you have to see that as a form of bravery from an animal that doesn't even certainly understands loyalty, but cannot possibly understand what the geopolitical consequences that are leading to the First World War.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible that they were incredibly good at finding people, and that they did repeatedly. And I mean, they talk about the dogs that, like the French dog that literally dragged people back to the trenches. Uh-huh. That wasn't even necessarily something that they were all trained to do, but they still found ways to they knew enough about what they were doing that they went and saved these people. And I think that's one of the crazy things about say Sergeant Stubby. And there were numerous animals like this. I mean, Stubby was a stray dog they found when they were getting ready to come over to Europe, and he still performed the role of a mercy dog at times, where he was finding people and making sure and bringing help and stuff like that. And that's something that he apparently picked up on instinct. It's
just by the skills of dogs. I mean, one of the reasons that we domesticated dogs is they hunt the way that we do. They operate in packs the way that we do, but they also have senses that we don't have. And so, I think that what people, we breed a lot to specific characteristics, but what we figured out is how dog behavior intersects with human behavior. And so, the fact that it searches something wounded, that it searches for a man that's alive, that it knows that the person is in danger, Lassie is, can we fall down the well? I mean, that there is really a recognition of that, and smart animals, and they're still used in all sorts of purposes today. But the idea that they were used in such a massive purpose, and partly because they were expendable. I mean, partly because you could send dogs to do where, the doctor's not going to go out there and do that. Yeah. But partly because they're simply better at it because they can smell. You want to bring your doctor to someone you can actually save. Yeah. And then also just that whole idea that they offered comfort.
Incredible.
That they would come and be a warm body next to you so you didn't die alone. I mean,
and there were a lot of stories of that, of these animals, and it seems, I mean, gosh, it's a form of compassion there, and the dogs clearly know something about it's. They talked about it you talked about it in the episode where they were apparently very good at triaging. They knew who could be saved and who couldn't be, and they were able to provide that comfort. Gosh, with very little, it feels like reward to themselves. One of the things, I mean, there was so much happening in this episode that there was more to talk about that I didn't get to talk about. I remember reading a lot about the British guy who was in charge, essentially kickstarted their whole program, and his Airedales, which were these days, Airedales aren't really used for. We don't think of them as they don't do bomb sniffing and stuff like that, but they were the significant part of the war, and that was a lot of what the British did. I also remember reading. I was trying to figure out where I found that source, but before the war, the Germans liked collies and English dogs. And one of the ways they got those dogs is they actually had people. They were sending people to England to surreptitiously buy these dogs or take them so that they could build up their breeding programs. It's an interesting piece of the war that we don't think about. But
thinks about that,
yeah, that the Germans and and everybody except England essentially, and the U.S. which didn't do it. We never really had our own military program for it, although we did do some of it in Korea and World War II. Actually, used some dogs in these kinds of, especially the Red Cross did a lot of that. But it's a really interesting piece of history that I think.
It is, and it ties to a lot. I mean, we did one on the St. Bernards, and we did one. I mean, dogs are extraordinary creatures, and as extraordinary creatures, they've played extraordinary roles in human history. Yeah. There was a period, there was a long period probably in human history when, as our hunting companions, they kept whole groups alive.
Yeah.
And that's in prehistory, and we don't have a good recording of it. But there's a reason that dogs have been ubiquitous throughout. And war is a massive human endeavor, and of course it was going to include animals, and of course it was going to include dogs because wherever we go, we take dogs. But that's not certainly the only endeavor where dogs have made a difference. Yeah. But it's interesting to think about having to protect your dog breed for fear as a piece of military technology. Or we found out when we talked about. When we talked about Just Nuisance, who was the dog in South Africa, Great Danes were from Germany, but they call them Great Danes because of the war. They didn't want to say they were from Germany, and it's
interesting.
It's kind of funny. So they weren't raised in Denmark at all. They're not really a Danish dog, and now we call them Great Danes because of that. So it's kind of interesting when you see that weird intersection, that powerful intersection between animals and humans, and dogs and humans, because we have such a tight connection. And the way we did dog breeds and everything, you really see that you cannot really separate human history and dog history. No. You're going so far back into prehistory. Before the two of us were so integral to each other that we couldn't really, survive without each other. So it really makes you wonder, because you don't think if we go to, say, colonize Mars or whatever, you don't imagine the first thing we're going to put on a spaceship and try to get there is a dog. But it's almost hard to believe that we won't.
Yeah.
It is hard to believe that we could colonize the stars, that we wouldn't be taking dogs with us, because we have never colonized a frontier without dogs.
Without dogs.
Humans have just never done that. Wherever you are, there were always dogs.
So intertwined in history that we frequently forget.
Yeah.
and take for granted their contributions.
And write them in our history, into our history.
Yeah.
Yeah, forget their contributions. Yeah, and which is too bad because I mean, I don't know how you define hero, but I mean, if what these mercy dogs were doing was not heroic, then what is?
Right. I don't know. It's a different story to talk about. Whether the dogs or the pigeons, which you think probably have even less ability to understand what's going on. How much of what's going on do they get? But they got enough of it.
They certainly seem to. I don't want to anthropomorphize it, but they certainly act like they understand that this is important.
There's they talk about Stubby. He was promoted to a sergeant specifically for an action because, according to the Smithsonian, is where I read this version of the story, where there was a German taking pictures of trenches and the dog saw it and the German was like, "Oh, look, a dog," and Stubby barked at him and then attacked him and bit at his leg, and that was enough to keep him slowed down for the Allies to come and capture him. So they talk about Stubby having captured a German spy, and that's. It sure feels like he understands to some extent. He knows who the enemy is.
Yeah, how's he know who's a good guy, who's a bad guy? Dogs do that though. I mean, there's dogs that somehow know who to bite.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece of history, and it's one of those things where I think it's beautiful what the dogs were able to do.
It's a powerful episode. It's a touching episode. It is very difficult to watch that episode, listen to that episode, and not come to tears.
Yeah.
Just over how these companions have done for us what they've done and what they've sacrificed to do it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.